You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis. Norman Richmond. Lisa Watson is on the buttons, and we just concluded the Jazz Zone with T in Providence. We are in fundraising mode today, and joining us on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Gerald Horne has been a part of the Diasporic music family for several decades, and Gerald Horne is an African historian, author, and political activist known for his prolific writings on African American history, Marxism, and the intersection of race, class, and power. And he is a distinguished professor at the University of Houston and has authored over, it says 30 books, but I think it's more than that. But how are you doing today, sir?
Hey, it's all good.
I guess let Melinda kick everything off.
Yeah, let's get into, we didn't get to the BRICS summit last week.
So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa came together approximately 2009, 2010, South Africa being a late entrant. And it has developed tremendously. Now, U.S. imperialism feels that the ultimate goal of the BRICS is to replace the dollar with a new currency. That may very well happen, and it will have enormous consequences for U.S. imperialism. But right now, I think it's fair to say that the BRICS, they're trying to find ways to bypass the dollar. For example, with Russia-China trade, using the ruble and the renminbi as opposed to using the dollar, for example. And with regard to China-South Africa trade, trying to use the South African rand and the renminbi, and so on and so forth. It has grown tremendously. The late major entrant is Indonesia, the largest predominantly Muslim nation on planet Earth, a stalwart of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. You might recall that just a few weeks ago, the President Prabowo was just in St. Petersburg for an important international economic summit. And as well, Indonesia is being courted assiduously by U.S. imperialism. The BRICS also have developed a bank led by the former president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff. Needless to say, the tangerine tyrant in Washington has been directing blows at the BRICS. He claimed falsely that after he threatened to tariff the BRICS or any new entrants to the BRICS, that membership went down, attendance went down. For example, the recent summit in Rio de Janeiro. I think that represents the desperation of U.S. imperialism in the face of these multifaceted challenges. Indeed, I would be remiss if I failed to mention in this context the fact that erstwhile allies of U.S. imperialism, speaking of Britain and France, are, according to the Wall Street Journal, seeking to, quote, decouple, unquote, from U.S. imperialism without saying so. And in fact, they were reflecting upon the recent visit to London of President Macron of France, who was greeted warmly and rapturously. The recent visit to London of Chancellor Merz of Germany. Both visits led to declarations. And with regard to the latter, this is exceedingly important because as a person who spent a considerable amount of time in London for various reasons, mostly research, one of the facets of that town and of that country that is difficult to avoid is the very profound and deep anti-Berlin, anti-German sentiments, which to an extent is understandable since Britain and Germany were involved in two world wars, one about 100 odd years ago, another about 80 odd years ago. It's fair to suggest that along with Japan, it was Berlin that helped to destroy the British Empire. And this is something we should pay attention to because, as I might have mentioned in another context, with regard to the depredations of German imperialism in Africa, which I'm afraid to say many on the German left have ignored, BBC has been quite pointed in doing documentaries, for example, on the disastrous role of German expansionism and colonialism in Namibia at the turn of the 20th century, the first genocide of the 20th century, directed to the Herero and the Nama people, for example. And of course, Namibia is now clamoring for reparations, a point that no doubt will be made once more at the all-important summit of Caribbean and African nations taking place in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in September 2025. And once again, the organizing of delegations from North America. That organizing is proceeding apace. But in any case, to return to the main thread, all of what I've said thus far, led by the BRICS, are reflective. It's reflective of this multifaceted challenge to U.S. imperialism, which is something that needs further elucidation and something that we need to pay careful and close attention to.
Dr. Horne, could I ask you, when we talk about Indonesia, Indonesia was really, the anti-communist forces really wiped out the left in Indonesia. Could you, what is the state of the left in Indonesia in 2025? Have they recovered from, they killed thousands of Communist Party members, anybody on the left. Have they recovered from that?
Slowly but surely. You do not endure the massacre of hundreds of thousands of militants in Cadre in October 1965 and for weeks thereon afterwards without that leaving a deep and profound mark on the organization and on the society. So the Indonesian Communist Party was one of the most important and potent communist parties on planet Earth. And of course, you cannot begin to understand the current moment without understanding these massacres of communists, not only in Indonesia, but elsewhere. I've written elsewhere, for example, about the assassination of Aldo Moro, who was the Italian prime minister in the 1970s, who was about to effectuate the so-called historic compromise with the Italian Communist Party, which was at that point the largest communist party in Western Europe. And he was kidnapped and killed. I mean, there have been movies about it, in fact, which I highly recommend. So in order to understand the present moment, you have to understand the preceding decades. But as my initial comment suggested, despite the depredations inflicted bloodily by U.S. imperialism, U.S. imperialism is still in crisis. And in fact, in order to stand in the face of these challenges from the left, they felt compelled to make this deal with China a half century ago, leading to massive foreign direct investments in this largest of Asian nations, creating this juggernaut, which has now led to the BRICS. And that's where we began, and that's where we are.
I'd like to ask you about the crisis between Russia and Ukraine. Looks like the Western press is Putin is the bad man and Lewinsky is the good guy.
Well, this ties into the earlier point. When I referenced the summit in London with the leader of France and then the leader of Germany, what I could have mentioned, and perhaps what I should have mentioned, is that they're not only seeking to decouple from U.S. imperialism, they're also seeking a more muscular challenge to Russia, because from their point of view, U.S. imperialism is trying to pull the rug out from under the Kiev regime in Ukraine. As I pointed out numerous times in the past, there's a basic contradiction in terms of European politics and history. That is to say, as the Western European nations were getting fat on the plunder and pillaging of Africa and the Americas, they were not necessarily the leading force in their backyard. Speaking of Europe, Russia has a population of 150 million, twice as large, roughly, as that of Germany, the largest Western European nation. Keep in mind that during the heyday of the Soviet Union had a population of 250 million, for example, to put this in some sort of context. In other words, the Baltic republics, Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Georgia, Armenia. The list was long. And that obviously causes us to reflect upon the blow that was inflicted upon our movement when the Soviet Union was forced to decompose. But in any case, that brings us to the current crisis in Ukraine, where Mr. Trump has been scrambling of late. Now, he came into office pledging and promising to break with the Biden regime and their policy towards Ukraine. He said that it was dumb and stupid what Mr. Biden was doing, not least because he was driving Russia and China closer together. But in recent days and weeks, he's done a kind of 180-degree reversal. Now, I attribute this not only to his erratic personality, but also to the fact that the ruling Republican Party is heavily factionalized with contrasting and conflicting and contending forces that would tug any leader of that party in this direction and then in that direction. And Mr. Trump is responding, not least because a good deal of his base is upset with him because of what his administration has done or has not done with regard to the scandal involving Jeffrey Epstein, the late pedophile multi-millionaire, if not billionaire, who most likely was an asset for Israeli intelligence, helping to ensnare the rich and the powerful in various sex scandals, gathering evidence for same, and then using that for blackmail and to gain leverage for the benefit of Israel. I mean, for example, it's a well-known fact that Bill Gates of Microsoft fame, when he was forced into a divorce some months ago, that one of the contributing factors, according to Melinda French Gates, his former spouse, was his association with Jeffrey Epstein, for example. Bill Clinton is known to have had a relationship of some sort with Jeffrey Epstein. Mr. Trump himself has been known to have a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. In fact, on the front page of the New York Times today, there is a takeout with regard to that. And of course, the Wall Street Journal reported just a few days ago about this so-called bawdy birthday card that Mr. Trump sent to Jeffrey Epstein on his 50th birthday, which raises all manner of questions. I mean, I hope the investigative journalists are busy trying to ferret out what Mr. Trump meant when he talked about the secrets that Trump and Epstein shared. So this Epstein scandal has eroded part of Mr. Trump's base. And I think that that has created favorable conditions for his responding to the corporate media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, for example, who have been upset with his Ukraine policy, and therefore he's now pledging to send more weapons to Ukraine. He's saying that the weapons will be paid for by the NATO countries. I assume that includes Canada as well. And it has been suggested that the U.S. wants Mr. Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, to send missiles deep into Russian territory. To that end, the U.S. is considering, according to the Washington Post, sending Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine, which would require U.S. technicians to operate, which is obviously flirting with disaster. It opens the possibility of Moscow responding in kind by sending missiles into New York and Washington, of all things. So this is a very dangerous crisis that we're facing. It's not unfair to suggest that we may be on the brink of World War III, but perhaps the saving grace is that, as ever, Mr. Trump allowed himself an out, which is that he's going to come back in 50 days. That will take us to early September, and make a determination as to whether or not his demands on Moscow have been met, given the fact that Russia is proceeding energetically and pushing back Ukrainian military forces. By early September, it's possible that the war will have concluded. Mr. Trump will not have to follow up on his many threats. But in any case, he's also threatened to issue bone-crushing sanctions against Russia's trading partners. Interestingly enough, a major Russian trading partner in the billions of dollars is, you guessed it, the United States of America. So I guess these sanctions will also be imposed on Washington.
You're listening to Diasporic Music, and Dr. Horne, why should we're in fundraising mode? I would like to ask you why you think people should support Diasporic Music in particular and Black Power 96 in general.
Well, this program is where you come to hear sounds that you oftentimes do not hear elsewhere. I'm preparing my remarks for July 26th, the Cuban national holiday, which will be marked in Vancouver, British Columbia on, yes, July 26th. And I just wrote a sentence lauding Oscar Peterson, the Maharaja of the keyboard, who of course has roots in Quebec and has been renowned, was renowned before his passing in 2007 as a master of the 88, celebrated by Duke Ellington, amongst others. Now, where else can you go besides Diasporic Music to hear the sounds of one Oscar Peterson, not to mention other artists too numerous to mention, who generally are excluded from various organs of communication. Likewise, with regard to politics and political insight, where else can you go beyond this program to get insight and the nitty-gritty on the machinations of U.S. imperialism, the changing global correlation of forces, the rise of the BRICS, etc. And so that's why I urge any within range of my voice to pick up the phone and dial. What's that number again?
The number is 1-888-979-2796. Again, have a pen and paper, write down 1-888-979-2796. And say that you could also go online, and it's blackpower96.org/DM. And if you're on the Cash App, it's Black Power 96.
And I would like to say the doctor, or I shouldn't say doctor, but Oscar Emmanuel Peterson, he had roots in St. Kitts and I believe St. Croix, pardon me. I keep on thinking Barbados, something hook up in Barbados as well. But yeah, Oscar Peterson used to listen to Diasporic Music. We had a drop from him. We have a drop from him somewhere. But could we talk about the religious zealots growing in West Africa? That's a pretty serious situation, wouldn't you say?
I'm afraid so. And, sadly and tragically, oftentimes when I'm asked about West Africa here in the United States, there is a lot of understandable celebration of what's going on in Burkina Faso, the leadership of the charismatic Ibrahim Traore. But the questions I'm asked, oftentimes they default the State Department line, which is trying to question the role of China in that part of Africa. And this is at a time when religious zealots are on the march, not only in Burkina Faso, but in Mali, in Niger. They're even threatening U.S. imperial interests in Nigeria, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ghana, in Guinea-Conakry, etc. And this is something that really needs serious study, because my own hypothesis is that a weakening U.S. imperialism is cutting deals with Gulf monarchs. Recall the visit some weeks ago of Mr. Trump to the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, for example, Saudi Arabia. And part of the so-called bargain is that the imperialists will tolerate the threatening of their interests in Nigeria in terms of its oil, for example, Cote d'Ivoire in terms of geostrategic compatibility with U.S. imperialism, because U.S. imperialism is dependent upon the Gulf monarchs for capital, not only in terms of loans to the U.S. government to keep it afloat, investments in major U.S. corporations, but also reference that $400 million flying palace, that plane that the Qataris apparently have gifted to Mr. Trump. And so this is a very serious crisis. And I think it's also going to backfire against all sides. And I say that because we have this current crisis in Syria. Now, the crisis fundamentally involves conflicts that have led to Israel bombing Damascus, called that the Israelis, the Qataris, the Turks, and U.S. imperialism collaborated congruously to bring to power Mr. al-Jilani, Mr. al-Shara, a former al-Qaeda headmaster, former ISIS leader, and the toppling of the al-Assad regime aligned with Iran and Russia in a major blunder. Many of our friends on the left in the United States, they supported this ouster. They did not think it through. But perhaps even worse is that the Turks, Saudis, the Qataris, they supported this. And now they're going to have to contend with Israel unleashed, Israel unbound, Israel not only committing genocide in Gaza, terrorism on the West Bank, bombing Syria, bombing Iran, assassinating Hezbollah leaders in Lebanon. Israel, it seems to me, ultimately will have in the crosshairs the Gulf monarchs themselves, because if you're going to unleash your military, you probably are interested in plunder. And you have these rich Gulf monarchs that don't have strong militaries, but have quite a bit of resources. And then there's the concept of the greater Israel, which reaches from the Nile to the Euphrates, and that, of course, brings into our lens Iraq, which I also would imagine is in store for bombing sooner rather than later. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that there is an arc of instability stretching from West Africa through East Africa to the Gulf, that the Gulf monarchs are playing a role in stirring up their comrade religious zealots in West Africa, but they're going to have to watch their backs because Israel has been unleashed. And if Israel can bomb Syria after having brought to power the leader of Syria, well, then I don't think any country in that neighborhood is safe. And I haven't even gotten to the question of Egypt. So this is a major crisis, and U.S. imperialism is trying to portray itself as a nation that's seeking to restrain its obstreperous child, speaking of Israel. But I think that that's phony. I think that that's inaccurate, and that is something we're going to have to plumb more deftly.
You're listening to Diasporic Music, and we're in fundraising mode. I don't want to say that Africans in the Western Hemisphere have a history of supporting the struggle in Syria. I remember Kwame Ture talked about Syria decades ago. Also, the late, great Didan Kimati, who lived in Los Angeles, who was, I think his father, one of his parents was from Trinidad. He used to go to Syria quite a bit. Could you talk about the the fact that there are elements of Africans in the Western Hemisphere that have always supported struggles in the Middle East, in Syria in particular?
Well, part of this is dealt with somewhat in my book on Southern California armed struggle, ? And I point your audience to those pages because the Panthers were very close to the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, during the Arafat era, the era of the leadership of Chairman Yasser Arafat, which of course then brought them into closer contact with the father of Bashir al-Assad, Hafez al-Assad, who was in power during that time and the leader of the Arc of Resistance against Israeli expansionism. And that's what was foreseeable about this present catastrophe unfolding in Syria, which is that you don't have to be a geopolitical strategist to suspect that if al-Assad, who's leading the resistance against Israel, is toppled, then the next guy or the next person who comes to power is not necessarily going to be walking in his footsteps in that regard. But the problem is that, as ever, Israel is double-crossed al-Shara. That is to say, he was making all these noises about consorting with Israelis. In fact, he was meeting with Israelis in Baku, Azerbaijan. We got to pay more attention to Azerbaijan too, by the way. Just days before Israel bombed the Ministry of Defense in Damascus, for example. So in other words, these so-called alliances or relationships with Israel are untrustworthy because Israel will double-cross those who it helps to bring to power. And once again, I can be critical of the left for not being able to figure this out. But at least one can say about the left that unlike Turkey and Qatar and other nations that participated in this fiasco, the left doesn't have a foreign ministry. They don't have embassies in all of these places, access to think tanks, etc., which makes what's going on in Turkey in particular even more questionable.
You're listening to Diasporic Music. We are in fundraising mode, and we only have a couple of minutes left. And I'd like to make an appeal. Sandra is on the phone. Sandy is on the phone. She's on the phone and trying to help us raise some funds. And could you conclude, Gerald, by telling people why they must support Diasporic Music and Black Power 96?
So we're at a pivotal moment in world history. You see the crisis of U.S. imperialism. You see credible voices warning that we may be on the verge of fascism in the United States. If that proves to be true, it will not remain in the United States of America. That is to say, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you should worry if the flames will come into your house. And I'm thinking of the flames crossing the border into Canada, for example, or even crossing the oceans, or crossing the seas, crossing the waters into the Caribbean, for example. So we need diasporic music now more than ever. And if there was ever a time where one had to dig deeply into one's pocket, well, pull out a few ducats contribute to this worthy cause. That time is now.
And thank you, sir. And we will, I guess we will have our final fundraising next week. And thank you for the profound analysis, especially about the whole situation. And we need to study Indonesia more and more and more and more.
Here,
Thank you very much.
Good luck to you.
All right, is there, well, first we would like to thank Lisa for technical brilliance, keeping us sounding good. And any parting words, Melinda Francis?
Yeah, I'm just going to remind people where to go to donate. If you're on the computer, it's blackpower96.org/DM. And if you're on the Cash App, it's blackpower96. And if you are calling in your pledge, Sandy is on the phone, so call right now. Get your pen and paper, and the number is 1-888-979-2796. Again, it's 1-888-979-2796. One more time, 1-888-979-2796. So go and donate now.
And I guess we should thank the first of the admirer who gave us a generous pledge, and we wanted to shout out Octavia Butler, the great sci-fi writer from. I think she grew up in Pasadena, but she had roots in Louise. Don't forget Anna, please. But we would like to thank that comrade, and we'd also like to thank Kwame for his support at helping us with the diasporic music in cyberspace. Anything else, Melinda?
Yeah, also check out our website. We're on diasporicmusic.com. It has all our links. We are on Apple Podcast now. We're on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud. So check us out, follow the show, and again, donate at blackpower96.org/DM.
All right, so we're out, huh?
Yep.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people. Power to the people.